Hello everyone. My name is Amit Mehta, and I have with me Mr. Samir Shah, Executive Vice Chairman of Dwara Trust. Thank you everyone for joining in. Let me take a moment to introduce Samir Shah. Samir joined Dwara Trust in Feb of 2018 as Executive Vice Chairman. He has over 2 decades of experience in building institutions and market infrastructure. Prior to joining Dwara Trust, he was the managing director and CEO of NCDX, India's largest agri-focused commodity exchange. Before NCDX, he was chief business officer of Dubai Gold and Commodities Exchange, DGCX. Prior to this, he was working with Thomson Reuters for 17 years and also led Reuters India's operations as MD in South Asia. Samir began his career as an investment banker in Mumbai, helping companies unlock value through public offerings and buyout deals. He holds an MBA in finance and engineering. He also completed advanced management program from Wharton. Before I start, I wanted to remind the audience that we will have a question and answer session at the end of the chat session. You could either type your question in the chat section, or you could click on the raise hand icon that you see on the right side of your screen. If the instructions till now are clear, you could click on thumbs up and we could move to the chat session. Great. Thank you. Uh, so, Samit, thanks for joining us today evening.
Thank you, Amit.
What would be interesting to start with is if you could talk about Dwara Trust. I know it was previously called as IFMR Trust, uh, a very well-known institution. But in its new avatar, if you could talk about the origins, the thought process, the journey till now, and what are the projects that Dwara Trust is currently working on?
Sure. Firstly, thanks, Amit, for hosting this chat. It's a pleasure to talk to you, as well as all this, the guests who have logged in to listen to this chat. So Dwara, in its earlier avatar, used to be called IFMR Trust, as you rightly mentioned. We were founded in 2008, and this was founded by a bunch of ICICI bankers, about 25, 30 of them, basically led by Nachiket Moore and Bindu. So Nachiket and Bindu left ICICI Bank with the blessings of ICICI Bank, and a combination of a grant and a loan from ICICI Bank to set up this initiative of financial inclusion. And the idea was that they came to the conclusion jointly with the board of ICICI Bank that pursuing deep financial inclusion and really sort of not just deep inclusion, but also an impact on policy change in the construct of a large banking environment was a bit difficult. The better way to do it would be to sort of break out and create a firm or a platform that is dedicated to the cause of financial inclusion. And that's how it was blessed by the bank. The board of ICICI Bank gave a combination of a grant and a loan, and about 25, 30 ICICI bankers then came to Chennai, set up shop in 2008, and IFMR Trust was born. It is set up as a private trust, as a not-for-profit private trust, and the mission of that trust is to achieve financial inclusion for all individuals and enterprises in India. So it's a pretty lofty, ambitious mission. And given that it was specifically set up as a trust, and there was a reason why it was set up as a trust and not as any other corporate structure, was because it was set up by a group of passionate individuals, professionals, who had a certain sort of vision and a mission in mind. And it was felt that from their own experience that as, at least for the holding company, at least for the trust, that it should not be sort of subject to changing dynamics of investor composition, So if it was set up as a sort of commercial entity raising capital and so on and so forth, then as investors change hands, and you know that better than I do, that different cohort of investors come in with different perspectives, and there are lots of pulls and pushes that take that organization in different directions. And that would be great for the underlying entities, but may not be great for the parent. And the parent, the trust as a vehicle was best suited to achieve really long-term vision, alignment, and provision of patient capital to our group entities. So with that intent, the trust was set up, and the trust took on activities both commercial in nature as well as policy in nature. So today we have 8 companies in the group, with Dwara Trust being the parent.
Right.
Of these 8, 7 are commercial entities, and there is one which is a very high quality independent policy and research think tank called Dwara Research. And they're all sort of the DNA of each one of these companies is very aligned. So the commercial entities sort of walk the talk. So we demonstrate what we espouse through our research and policy advocacy. And they feed off each other. So although they're both, the commercial and the research work is at arm's length, but principle-wise, they feed off each other, so that the research work is also grounded in evidence that comes out of what we observe and experience in our commercial effort. And the commercial effort makes an attempt to actually demonstrate that what we are talking about in sort of research, we are able to sort of commercially execute at scale on the field. So that's really been sort of the driving factors. So we've now sort of 12 years hence, we rechristened ourselves to Dwara Trust in about 3 years ago. Dwara as in Dwar in Hindi, or origin in Sanskrit, which indicates access or door to financial services. And out of the 7 commercial entities, we've got 2 NBFCs. One, of course, is where you are a co-investor with us.
Right.
And that's Northern Arc. We stepped down as promoter of Northern Arc a couple of years ago. We continue to remain a active investor in that journey. But all the other 6 entities, we are promoters, active promoters, and take a very active lead in strategy formulation and direction of those entities, and mentoring the management teams and working closely with our investor partners. So that's been our journey. And I think it's been a fascinating journey because we've touched financial inclusion from almost every lens that's possible, either from policy work or from actual execution in financial services. And even within execution in financial services, we've looked at it from wholesale finance, retail finance, technology. At the policy work, we have looked at consumer protection. We've looked at the architecture of small finance banks, payment banks. So we've looked at account aggregators. We've been deeply involved in many of these conversations with policymakers as well. So we were, for example, the research secretariat to the RBI committee that created the guidelines for payment banks. Although the sort of track record of payment banks, the jury is still out in terms of the success of that model, but and I'm sure we can talk a bit about that. But we were instrumental in helping RBI think through a differentiated banking model that we felt and continue to feel is required to achieve financial inclusion in India, and that a monolithic sort of universal banking model is probably not the right way to go. So that's a bit of a background. Hope that gives you some perspective as to how we are structured, who we are. But happy to talk in detail as we go along.
Right, absolutely. That sounds interesting. If you played a role in nudging RBI into developing differential banking licenses, I think that's quite an achievement. I know about Northern Arc, and I know about Dwara KGFS, which is the flagship microfinance entity that your trust has. And today we want to talk about microfinance a little bit more in detail. But before we do that, I just want to touch upon some of the other initiatives that Dwara Trust has. Would be good to learn about some of the other entities. You mentioned you have 7 entities other than Northern Arc. Would be interesting to learn about 1 or 2 entities which you think are at the frontier of financial inclusion, and are really doing something which may not have achieved scale today, but are interesting from a cutting edge perspective.
Sure. So to give you a background, when we started in 2008, Amit, we started with a cohort of 4 companies originally, in addition to the parent, which was IFMR Trust. And in the cohort of 4 companies, we had KGFS, IFMR Capital, which used to be the earlier name of Northern Arc, Dwara Solutions, and Dwara Research. These were our original first cohort of 4 companies. Then in 2018, each of these 4 companies had achieved a certain size and scale and impact over the journey of 10 years. In 2018, we sort of took a step back and said that the world in India has changed quite significantly in financial inclusion, not just within Dwara, but externally as well. A lot of progress had been made by then. We had UPI, massive growth in payment infrastructure in India. We had the Jan Dhan account proliferation, and almost every adult Indian had an access to a bank account, and a reasonably world-class payment infrastructure. A large expansion of the microfinance industry, and early success of the small finance bank. So we sort of took a step back and said, okay, what are the missing gaps? And the missing gaps from our lens tends to be very long term, because we are the kind of investor who not very deep pockets, but certainly have a deep perspective and very long-term patient capital. What are some of the sort of chronic problems, challenges that still continue to remain, and they'll continue to remain, right? I mean, financial inclusion in India is going to be a long-term journey, and what are those problems that we can solve? So we looked at a couple of interesting areas. We looked at 2 areas, and we're now building out initiatives in those areas. One is to sort of digitize rural assets, and what I mean by assets is movable assets, things like crop and cattle. And if you look at the rural sort of consumer base in financial inclusion, or the rural borrower base, 90% of them are engaged either in agriculture or allied activities, or in dairy activities, right? Small and marginal dairy farmers. And if you could find a way using cutting edge technology to digitize crop, digitize cattle,
Right.
and then render those assets in a digital real time way to insurers and lenders, we could bring alive those assets in a lot more meaningful manner using sort of cutting edge tools like remote sensing, AI, machine learning, and create a repository of these assets in real time, and thereby unlock access to capital to small and marginal farmers, both dairy farmers as well as agriculturists. And we've had some experiments in Orissa, and they've been proven to be very, very successful. So happy to talk a little bit about that. And the second initiative we've embarked on is to really create because KGFS predominantly is a rural initiative, rural finance initiative. So we felt that the urban underserved also was a very interesting segment to work with, to see whether we can create a platform for serving urban underserved. So we've got 2 initiatives now which are at early stages of incubation, but early signs are very, very promising, and happy to talk about them as we go along.
I absolutely loved the idea of cattle's having digital tags. Seemed like what was done to warehouse receipts kind of thing. So probably in future, just like warehouse receipts, agri warehouse receipts, there will be cattle receipts which will sort of get discounted or get lended against. So that sounds like a very, very interesting idea. And given the abundance of cattle stock in India, probably could emerge as a large, interesting asset class going forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds really interesting. So maybe we could now dive into one of the largest entities that you have other than Northern Arc in your bouquet, which is Dwara KGFS. Dwara KGFS is the microfinance initiative of Dwara Trust, right? Why don't you take a minute to talk about what is Dwara KGFS and what is the current state there?
So KGFS stands for Kshetriya Gramin Financial Services. We conceived of Dwara KGFS as a deep rural NBFC. And by the way, Amit, we've deliberately not taken an MFI license for that entity. We have taken an NBFC license, and I'll talk a bit about why we have done that as a deliberate sort of approach. But let me sort of step back before I talk about what approach we took to talk about what problems we were looking to solve. One of the things we were looking to solve is to provide almost like a private banking experience to low-income households in rural, and not take only a credit-centric approach, which is what the MFI industry largely takes. And nothing wrong with that. We just felt that a credit-centric approach typically tends to then, if credit is very easily available, consumers will have a tendency to use credit as a substitute for many other things. And we see that as being the case. So credit tends to get used as a substitute for savings, as a substitute for insurance, and then at the rate at which a microfinance entity can offer credit, which is upwards of 20% typically, it may be a very expensive solution to solve some problems, right? So if there is, for example, a calamity, and exactly of the types that we are going through right now. I mean, what we are going through right now is a massive one, but let's say a cyclone. Gaja was a classic example, which was a cyclone that hit certain districts in Tamil Nadu about 18 months back. And there is no proven robust natural calamity insurance not available in India right now.
Right.
In the absence of that, we tend to solve that problem by giving more credit to the borrower, and that at 20% plus takes the borrower into a deeper sort of debt crisis or a vicious cycle. So the way we thought that the vicious cycle can be turned into a virtuous cycle is to have a combination of credit, savings, pension, and insurance. And in the right combination, given that to a household, that would be a much better solution to a household. So KGFS was set up with the sort of the dream to really curate a combination of savings, insurance, credit, and pension in the right combination for a particular household after deeply understanding that household. So the first building block of KGFS is a holistic multi-asset, multi-product platform. That's the first building block. The second building block is to be very, very deep and very saturated model. So on one hand, most of our lenders don't like the saturated model that we have. But from an impact perspective, we believe that a saturated model is fantastic because it lifts the entire geography at one go. If you drive past certain districts in Tamil Nadu, for example, you will, at every 10-15 kilometers, you will drive past a KGFS branch. A typical MFI would operate at what is called as a operating radius of 40-45 kilometers. We operate at a 10 to 15 kilometer service area, and that's a deliberate strategy. And then we sort of try and saturate that area with having 25-30% market share at least in that geography, which means that that the whole market, the entire population in that village or in that cluster of villages gets better access to credit, better access to savings, and so on and so forth. And seen over a long period of time, the entire economy of that village or the cluster of villages actually goes up. So not only is it great business sense because it gives us economies of scale, uses a limited management bandwidth across a concentrated area and achieve large scale market share and penetration, but also from an impact perspective, which we care about a lot, and thereby attract impact investors as well. It shows significant amount of impact. So that's the sort of second building block of KGFS, which is remote rural and deep saturation. And of course, there is a balance to be achieved between saturation and diversification, and we are figuring that out. The third building block is through deep use of technology. So we always been deeply committed to use of technology. When we set up our branches in 2008, if you walk into a KGFS branch, it's like walking into a rural Starbucks type center. I'm exaggerating a bit from this point, but they've got exactly the same look and feel. Every branch looks the same, irrespective of which state you are in. Our frontline field officers are in a uniform. So you can look at the uniform and you can say that this is a KGFS wealth manager. We call them wealth managers. We don't call them field officers. So they're called wealth managers. So it's we are branded very differently in the geographies we operate. We're deeply committed to technology. We were one of the first institutes in the country to use tab technology when communications and internet links in 2008 were quite poor. We set up our own communication towers, next to every branch. So we invested in setting up, a comms tower next to our branch, just so that we had cutting edge access to communications technology. So very deeply committed to technology. So this is basically our three building blocks of KGFS. It is a painfully slower process to scale on the other side. So not all is great. Our peer group has over the same period of time, those who have taken a straight microfinance route have become larger than us.
Right.
We are at 1,000 crores assets under management, present in 6 states, 300 odd branches.
Right.
And we grow consistently 35% year-on-year growth,
Right.
reasonably profitable. So we are quite happy about the balance that we've been able to achieve between commercial sustainability and impact on the ground. And that's really sort of the differentiating aspect of this model.
Right. That sounds very interesting. So, you know, microfinance is probably one of the most impacted asset class in this COVID event. Would be good to understand from you what the current ground situation is. We are about to enter lockdown 4, uh, which is a lot more relaxed from where we started. Uh, so, would be a lot of us in Mumbai probably don't know exactly what is happening on the ground, right? So would be good to understand from you what the ground realities are. What is the economic activity looking like in various parts of India? How are you seeing it from your perspective?
Sure. I think it is, to be fair, and it is early days. But what we are seeing right now is sort of early signs of what might be quite different in a couple of months from now. At least from a rural lens, which is what we have predominantly from the KGFS perspective, we've found that although everyone is affected, there is no question that everyone is affected across the country and globally, and significantly affected. We found that most of our borrowers or customers have been engaged in essential services type activities. So agriculture allied, small and marginal dairy farmers running small provision stores in villages, and by and large, after the first 2 3 weeks 4 weeks of lockdown, some of them have been able to get back on their feet with not at scale, not at pre-COVID-19 levels of operations, but at least some amount of business has started. So our sense is that the rural community is in that sense slightly less affected as compared to urban underserved and the MFIs that are focused on the urban or semi-urban customer base. I think rural are slightly less affected, and within that, of course, there are various customer segments. So if you even sort of further segment the customers, we find that those people, borrowers who are engaged in agriculture and allied, or small and marginal dairy farmers, and people who run provision stores are to that extent slightly more resilient. Those that were engaged in running a small restaurant, a small tea stall, those kind of things, or a small electrical shop, a mechanic shop, those are slightly more affected because those were pretty much shut down, and they are beginning to open up now, but for the first couple of months, pretty much affected. We are seeing, when we did a large-scale, high-frequency survey of about 500,000 customers at KGFS, we found that many of them, despite the moratorium offer, did express intent to pay. So we found that at least 56% of consumers or borrowers expressed inclination to pay. Of course, we have limited ability to, yeah, yeah.
56%. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But that was, of course, a survey, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we are seeing in the early days now, from 1st of May, we've started to reach out to customers, given that the field operations have been reasonably open during lockdown 3.0. And we've asked customers, although you have a by default, the extended moratorium to everyone. So there was a by default opt-in to moratorium. And on an exception, those customers who wanted to opt out could opt out. So we are beginning to see up to between 7 to 10% of collection efficiency in the first 15 days of May.
Okay, so 7 to 10% of the customers are opting out of moratorium and paying their dues on
Yeah,
time.
yeah. And
That's
that's been sort of the 15-day observation. Things could change dramatically. And this is, with the clarity to the consumer that by default, we've offered you moratorium, right? So you're under absolutely no pressure. If and only if you feel that you have the resources and the wherewithal to pay, you may choose to opt out. So that situation could change from 1st of June if the moratorium goes away, because then there would be, there would be a more disciplined activity towards collection. So that's the, these are the trends that we are seeing. So we are constrained by mobility still, so our ability to move out in the field. So we've invested a significant amount of time and resources in digital payments. We are seeing again a huge amount of appetite from borrowers to pay digitally through UPI, for example. There is, of course, a significant amount of transaction error when we pushed the pedal hard on UPI. We integrated that in 2-3 weeks we were up and running on UPI based collections, and we pushed that engine really hard. And we found that although the engine was available and some consumers had smartphone capability even in remote rural, the transaction errors were significant. We almost find 40 to 50% transaction errors in UPI payments.
That's quite surprising.
So yeah, so that's what we are seeing so far.
Great, interesting. So demonetization sort of was the catalyst event for converting, MFI disbursements into digital disbursement. Would COVID do that in terms of collections?
I absolutely think so. I think this is the steer for collections. Although the world might stabilize slightly, and whatever stability means, and in the new context, we don't know. But we may find that mobility movement starts becoming easier over the next 2-3 months, and the providers may fall back to field operations and stuff like that. But we do think that this is a significant move to digitization of collections. But I do think that the infrastructure is not, we on paper we have infrastructure, but in reality, at the last mile, it's not perfect.
I say that more because your center meetings or group meetings could be a risk event in light of the COVID pandemic, and may continue to remain prohibited even post every lockdown is taken off. So there is a chance that just like religious events etc are not allowed, or gathering above a certain number is not allowed, they may just specifically prohibit MFIs from conducting physical group meetings. So is digital collection becoming will it become a necessity for you guys? Is the microfinance ecosystem in a position to tackle that situation?
So I think digital collections is going to be an imperative to survive in the post COVID-19 scenario. And as I just mentioned to you, we've sort of completely gone digital in the last 2 months. However, and I do think that it's not such a difficult task. It just requires commitment from the MFI industry to get this done. And I do think that many MFIs that I talk to are embracing digital collections, digital payments quite aggressively. However, I think the big bottleneck is going to be the quality of infrastructure. And as I mentioned, the high amount of failure rates is going to come in the way of mass scale adoption. And those failure rates are not an outcome of the poor implementation by the providers, but really back-end technology mismatches in biometric, the error rates that are coming from Aadhaar-enabled services. So that entire infrastructure is not as robust as we thought it was. We thought we had solved that problem after demonetization, but it's far from getting solved. One of the other data points we have is that we also are AEPS cash withdrawal. We also offer AEPS-based cash withdrawal services at each one of our branches, and we had made that available almost a month and a half back, because as the government DBT funds started to hit low-income households' bank accounts, we wanted to be able to offer our branches as a means for cash withdrawal, and we saw tremendous take-up from our consumers and borrowers. However, even there, we saw almost a 50% transaction failure on that. So I think the quality of infrastructure is going to be tested quite significantly, and we need to work together as an industry along with RBI, NPCI, etc., to just take it to the next level.
Right. So post Demon and right up to this event, microfinance industry as a whole saw tremendous growth, and the while the investor community lapped it up, There also were concerns about over leverage and industry practices. I'm aware that there are industry body codes in terms of the leverage at individual levels and so on and so forth. But there also have been SFBs and banks which have very large microfinance portfolios which have been out of these sort of soft guidelines, and the borrower level leverage concerns have continued to remain. A large part of the losses during Demon era were attributed to this kind of over leverage. Obviously, there were those political angles as well, but by and large, this was the one common theme across geographies. Uh, Similar concerns are being raised at this point in time. I wanted to get your sense on how you see losses across institutions, at the industry level. Uh, what kind of losses do you see happening in microfinance portfolio across industry levels? And I then sort of want to build that up into what is the implication of all of those losses on equity investor interest in this segment, and how lenders uh, are supposed to behave. But if you could talk a bit about the industry level losses first.
So I think, just based on our experience, and we've of course not had anything like this. What we're seeing right now, there's nothing of this scale and magnitude to really model out. But whatever data points we've had in the past, we've had demonetization, we've had the Uttarakhand floods, we've had the Odisha Fani cyclone, Chennai floods, Kerala floods, Gaja cyclone in Tamil Nadu, and we've modeled all of that out both through our experience at Northern Arc as well as specifically KGFS, customer behavior pre and post some of these.
Yeah.
Amit, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there, Samesh.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So we've had these, few instances where we've been able to model out the customer behavior. And one of the things we've seen is that these consumers, how much ever we feel that they are low income and in distress, their resilience is just phenomenal. A typical household will have at least 2 or 3 livelihood activities to rely on. So they are fairly diversified and resilient in terms of livelihood activities. And we've seen that between from 6 to 9 months is what they take to get back to being current on their repayments. So typically, in 6 to 9 months from now, you fast forward today's period to 6 to 9 months from now, we've seen that 85 to 90% of the borrowers will get to current, become current on their repayment schedules. They may be, 3 to 6 EMIs behind by that time.
Okay.
And that may continue, and that will become par 90 and stuff like that, going forward. But in 6 to 9 months from now, they'll at least start to be current. Now, that's what we've seen in the past. Now, COVID-19 may be very different, and it's really hard to tell those trends, from where we sit right now. But I would model for for at least a 6 to 9 month kind of delinquency for 40 to 50% of consumers, and then reducing. So as things progress, we will see them becoming current, and then over a period of time, over 12, 18 months, them wiping out all of their sort of past overdues. So a restructuring exercise after moratorium finishes is going to be very critical for lenders, providers to embark on. If we don't embark on a restructuring exercise, I think those will then sit as non-performing assets, and provisions and losses will mount quite significantly. But we do know that if they are restructured, and this is what is the right thing to do for the borrower, that these borrowers do get back. Now, COVID-19 may be a different scenario altogether,
Yeah.
And it's too hard to say how that will play out.
Sure. So you're saying 6 to 9 months of dues for 50% of the customers. If I assume a 24-month duration, which may not be the absolute right, probably the industry average would be somewhere around 18 months. But if I assume 24 months, that would amount to about 12.5% kind of a number. Uh,
Yeah, I think we should, I mean, again, it's hard to call that
yeah,
out, but
yeah,
it's
yeah,
just
absolutely. Ballpark,
just based on past experiences, this is what we have seen.
ballpark. Got that. And that 12.5% could be recovered over a longish period of time
Yeah,
through restructuring, etc. Is what you're saying.
yeah, yeah.
Got that. So, Samir, the industry enjoys excellent profitability in good times, and then there are these black swan events, which no longer are black swan. They happen every 2-3 years. Uh, how do you think sort of equity investors will sort of react to this? Because I know that this event will cause solvency and liquidity issue both for a bunch of microfinance institutions. So how would equity investors sort of react to uh, an event like this? Do you see equity fundraising becoming difficult for small and mid-sized MFIs?
I do think that for small and mid-sized MFIs, it is going to be a challenge. It is going to be about those MFIs and NBFCs who have the quality of operations. So it is now from June onwards, and in fact even May onwards, it's going to be the quality of operations, the quality of customer relations, the quality of interactions with customers that is going to be able to determine which ones are going to demonstrate great collections, a great ability to restructure, a good amount of liability capacity, liability platform to raise fresh debt, and to start to work with borrowers on on fresh disbursements and so on and so forth in the next 1.5 months. So it's going to be the quality of operations that's going to sort of filter out the good ones from the ones that may find it difficult to survive. So I do think that this is going to create an opportunity for a shakeout. So there will be small and mid-sized MFIs, and already I know just from talking to the industry that there are already a few of them that are making that are approaching investors for consolidation. So I do think that this will result in consolidation. From an equity investor's perspective, I think if the equity investors end up supporting the right entities, that from a medium to long term, this sector still has tremendous opportunity. Right, it's still, although we see over leverage and excessive borrowing in one type of customer base, but by and large, financial inclusion is still at a very, very early stage in the country. The amount of credit depth in the country is still very poor, and tremendous opportunity still exists. So I do think that this is not the end of financial inclusion. It is going to be about consolidation in the short medium term, focusing on the right assets and focusing on those that have reimagined their business model, especially in the context. And I think that the reimagination of business model will happen two ways. One is moving from JLG to individual lending, which has been a long overdue sort of restructuring of the microfinance model, and we didn't talk much about that so far, but happy to talk about that. And the second is the digitization. So
Right.
those entities that undertake significant amount of digitization, and
Right.
those entities that diversify from the group lending model and focus on an individual lending model, are the ones that are going to survive and come out as resilient and future-proof business models.
Right. Interesting. You brought up the group lending model, which has been sort of the origin of microfinance institutions. How do you see that changing going forward? With more and more data being available, and would people sort of move away from group lending, and would individual lending become the core of MFI institution? Would everyone be comfortable? Before that, at ground level, have you really seen the group model sort of act as a cushion in your collections, or was it always individual?
There are several nuances to your question. I think I don't think we are at a stage where the group lending is going to go away. anytime soon. I do think that this is going to be a trigger for getting a better balance between group lending and individual lending. So this is going to drive that focus, and saying that, okay, let's start to look at better underwriting of an individual household, better understand their occupations, their livelihoods, their ability to pay, and their sort of and understanding their cash flows, and start to think of individual lending. It's going to be very difficult to achieve the scale of individual lending that group lending has been able to achieve. So I don't think it's going to become the mainstay, but I do think that a diversified portfolio of individual lending will happen over the next sort of years. That's point number one. Point number two, whether the group lending offers a cushion, it's a yes or no, yes and no. It does offer a cushion. We know in several examples that that the group does come together and help out another group member in times of distress. But how much can they bear? How often? If it's a one-off thing, we've seen that the group acts as a cushion very well. If it's a one-off thing, if it's a repeated activity, and if everyone is going through a stress, right, then those that do insurance in the social contract may not really hold for too long. But in one-off situations, we do know that the social contract has tremendous amount of equity. But this is not a one-off event. At least it is a one-off event, but it's going to last for a while. So not sure if the group lending will continue to offer that cushion. So I do think that there will be a move towards individual lending by MFIs. It won't be the mainstay still. It'll be hard to create that scale, but a distinct shift towards specific underwriting of cash flows and individual lending and interesting more digital lending models will start to emerge out of this exercise.
Right, interesting. You spoke about consolidation in the market. There's another perspective to this, that in the last wave of small finance bank licenses, the regulator gave out a majority of the licenses to larger MFIs, which sort of indicated regulators' discomfort with such large MFIs being outside of the tight regulatory ambit that a banking license sort of brings. Given the periodicity with which this asset class has faced risk events, do you think the regulator will now force some of these banks, which now have large microfinance assets on their book, to diversify? And because when the asset side sort of faces such large events, the depositors to whom the regulator is answerable face risk, and from a regulator's point of view, having a diversified asset mix is makes the depositor money more safer. So do you think regulators will force SFBs to diversify, and we could see them going on an inorganic shopping spree immediately post this event? And two, do you think this will be a big event that will sort of deny SFB license to most of the large MFIs, and the larger MFIs, before they sort of go to RBI for SFB license, will have to diversify their asset base?
It's hard to say, Amit, whether a regulator will do that sort of proactively. I do think that a lot of what you say is a very likely scenario and very likely to happen, irrespective of a regulator's push. And that's because shareholders will drive some of that diversification. So there will be the recognition that the MFI asset class is yes, a very profitable and fast growing asset class, but goes through its ups and downs every 3-4 years. There are significant blips and significant exposures that come up. So and this event is going to sort of ask that question extremely strongly. So I do think that management and shareholders will drive that agenda with SFBs and a diversified portfolio. And we've seen some of the first batch of SFBs already doing a lot of that. We've seen them, becoming more urban in their asset profile. We've seen them becoming more enterprise in their asset profile. So we've seen that diversification already happening from where they were earlier as MFIs. So I think that will continue. I'm not sure if it would be a regulator push. That would be hard to hard to predict.
Got that. Got that. So we will be opening up the floor for Q&A in a minute, and audience could ask questions by either typing in the questions chat section, or you could raise hand, and then I will sort of bring you on the stage and you can ask the question directly. So if you want to ask a question, please click on raise hand button on your right side. Before I go to the audience for question and answer, let me ask you something. Two interesting questions. One is, will microfinance field staff also see work from home?
It's going to be a hard one for field staff to work from home. I mean,
Right.
it was one thing to do it for 2 months, and an entirely another thing to do it as a sort of normal model.
Right.
So it'll be hard to sort of recreate that in a sustainable fashion.
Right, got that. Also, you have several initiatives and several financial inclusion entrepreneurs are there in the audience. So one question that they could have on their mind is, does Dwara Trust fund independent ideas? Do you do that in the financial inclusion space?
So, and interestingly, there's a question I think Aditi asked for biggest opportunities for some entrepreneurs who, entrepreneurial leadership in Dwara, in the group who went on and did their own initiatives, namely Samunati, Viviti, and Kaidofin. So, I mean, honestly, yes, it was a missed opportunity. There's no question. But there's no easy answer around that. But what we did in response to that in 2 years ago, because there's so much talent within Dwara and so much sort of so much insight and experience, that 2 years ago we launched a entrepreneur in residence program, an EIR program, where in order to unleash and unlock the entrepreneur potential that exists within the Dwara group, we said if there is somebody who's got a bright idea and really wants to set off and do their own business, we'd be quite happy to promote these ideas and recognize them as entrepreneurs in residence, give them access to initial capital, and help them build those businesses as we go along. And that has been the model for our 4 new startups that we have launched in the last 12 to 18 months. They've all been modeled on an EIR model, entrepreneur in residence model, with significant amount of sweat equity given to the entrepreneurs, and with Dwara being a patient long-term capital provider. So that is a model that we believe is our model for growth and impact in the future. And to that extent, if there are entrepreneurs in the audience outside who are interested in being EIRs at Dwara, we would welcome welcome a conversation to see what can we do together.
So you have an EIR program, but you don't really go out and invest equity pretty much like a financial inclusion fund. That's not on the table.
Not yet, but a fund is on the horizon. We have a plan for setting up a financial inclusion AIF in the next sort of 12 months or so. In that fund, we will obviously then start doing minority investment support to entrepreneurs. But at this stage, we have a EIR model. And we would welcome EIR opportunities, conversation opportunities with aspiring entrepreneurs.
Anish had a question about if you see more of MFIs applying for and adopting SFB model. I think we briefly discussed that, but do you think this event will nudge MFIs to move towards SFB license?
Yeah, I do think at least the well-established ones and good, strong ones, I think will prefer an SFB route because it's a lot more resilient model. And from a regulatory architecture perspective, certainly something that the Reserve Bank is wanting to promote. So I do think that this will accelerate interest in the SFB model. But of course, it'll be the well-established ones who can survive this crisis, come out looking good, and come out being able to attract capital, because an SFB application will require significant amount of infusion of capital in order to bolster sort of the war chest and the balance sheet. But I do think that it'll be a desirable option for the good, well-run MFIs.
Sorry. Karuna has asked how effective, according to you, were the special liquidity scheme and the TLTRO schemes of government? How effective have they been?
I think the schemes have been fantastic. The implementation could have been, or I wouldn't comment on the implementation, but the outcome could have been better. So the TLTR, including moratorium and TLTRO, we found that some of the banks were reluctant to extend moratorium to the NBFCs and MFIs. Continues to be the case even now. Even after a couple of months when the moratorium policy was announced, and TLTRO also 1.0 was clearly at AA plus sort of entities. TLTRO 2.0 was meant specifically for investment grade NBFCs and MFIs, but we have seen very low appetite from banks to participate in those programs. So we haven't seen a trickle down effect as much as we would have liked from both these programs so far.
So you're saying it hasn't really trickled down as much. It's been several weeks since that TLTRO auction, which was specifically for NBFC and MFIs, that has happened. So it hasn't yet trickled down, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
It in any case saw a very poor response. There were only 50% takeoff, and the second part of that auction hasn't yet taken place. Quite surprisingly.
And we've seen, I mean, not surprisingly, we've seen banks, being very wary of the risk, that is going to unfold, and hence, I think that has been sort of the main factor why they've been very passive in participation in TLTRO 2.0. So we'll see that now in conjunction with the reset packages, where first loss and stuff like that has been offered by the government directly. We'll see how that sort of helps in reducing the risk sort of perception of the banking system.
Got that. TT Venkatraghavan has a question about the viability of building a profitable wealth management business that caters to rural India, given the small or sachetized nature of these of the products there. So,
Yeah.
how has your experience been on the wealth management side? I recall you mentioning at the beginning of the conversation that you do offer savings product to Dwara KGFS customers. How has your experience been in terms of making that part of the business viable?
So I think that take up, there are two aspects to that answer. One is the take up from the consumer, and second is commercial sustainability and the commercial returns of that business from a provider's perspective. So from a take up from a consumer, it has been extremely effective. Just our KGFS experience, we were one of the largest NPS distributors when NPS was allowed to be distributed by NBFCs. Then there was a change in rules, and the only banks were allowed to distribute that product. So we had to unfortunately stop that product, but we had some very good success in that. Even today, in the KGFS customer base, we have almost every customer of ours has at least one more product taken from KGFS other than the asset product, which is basically a liability product, and that excludes the credit shield product. So not including that, we have at least one more product, liability product, that is offered to consumers. So from the consumer lens, there is definitely a very strong appetite to understand and take up liability products, right? So then the question is, how effective is it, and how profitable is it, or sustainable is it commercially from a provider's perspective? And there certainly there is a challenge, because typically the margins on liability products, the tail fees, etc., are not very attractive, and hence it requires a different approach. It requires more about creating bundles. So we've seen that when you create bundles for the customer base, which is a combination of products which are then sort of so for example, you could have a credit product and a Hospicash as a combination of Hospicash. We found that Hospicash is an extremely relevant product for for low-income households, especially in rural. But selling it on a standalone basis may not be economical and profitable. But if you then sort of start to take an approach where it's offered in combination, at least the sales model, with of course full transparency and disclosure to the consumer, we find that that is a better way to approach that business model.
Got
Uh,
that.
so I think there is, from the consumer's perspective, very strong appetite. From a provider's perspective, requires innovation.
Right. Interesting. The data point that you gave in terms of cross sell of products for Dwara KGFS solution, customers is very, very encouraging. So the takeaway really is that if you ride on an existing distribution infrastructure, probably there could be a model which could be viable.
Yeah.
Hiranya has a question about asset quality. I think we answered that that there could be anywhere between 10 to 15% 90 plus DPD number that you could see in the next 6 to 9 months. The second question that Hiran has is in terms of even if RBI provides enough liquidity to MFIs, uh, what do you think they will do? Whether they will sit on cash or will they grow the assets? I think basically the question is, have MFIs themselves become risk averse and will they hold back, or will they continue to aggressively push for growth?
So I think there are two parts to that. One is that most of the new facilities will come with an expectation of deployment baked into that facility. So there's no question that that facility can afford to sit as cash reserves for the MFI. It will have to be deployed into creating new assets from the wholesale lender's perspective and also from a guideline perspective. So it will not be it won't be possible to sit on cash for too long. Number two, it will be in the MFI's interest to continue to help borrowers in distress, either by offering emergency loans and so on and so forth, so that so that they can sort of get past the current crisis. So my sense is that the MFIs, the kind of products may be different. They may be, you may change tenure from a typical 18 to 24-month product to a more short-term 3 to 6 month emergency loan product, at least in the short term, before you get back to the plain vanilla sort of 18-24-month GLG product. So the kind of products may change in the short term, but I do see that there will be an appetite to by the MFIs to help their borrowers in requirement and get that liquidity engine going in their customer base. So I personally don't see a tendency to sit on cash for too long.
Got that. Pawan had a question about the JLG model and whether it will sort of stand the test of this stress. I think you mentioned that JLG model sort of works for a period of time, but not repeatedly and not under a circumstance in which everyone is under stress for a longish period of time. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, look, I mean, I think it's the only at-scale model, so I don't see it going away. I think it's proven, it has scale, it has profitability, it has consumer demand, so it's not going to go away. But as I mentioned earlier, I do think that we will see a shift towards individual lending, and I do see a shift towards and that driving deeper sort of underwriting capability by MFIs, because today MFI business is really a operations business. It's not so much a credit business. It's a collections and operations business.
Yeah.
But I do think that underwriting capability will start to increase, and a small portion of individual lending portfolio will start to grow. Won't overtake the classic JLG business for some time to come, but it will become a credible diversification strategy.
Okay, I think we'll take one last question, which is from Abhiram. His question is about the efficacy of digital collection model prior to COVID. So, have you run any pilots in this regard, and how effective did you find them?
Prior to COVID, of course, there was very little digital collection, right? I mean, some MFIs did go ahead and build those capabilities, but they weren't aggressively promoted. Most collections, in my knowledge, were in cash. But in the context of COVID, I think significant progress has been made, and that has also exposed a lot of fractures in that technology. So there are significant unresolved issues in that technology, which range from biometric mismatches to lack of Aadhaar seeding to infrastructure that banks have in terms of server capacity, timeout errors. So a lot of those kind of issues have been exposed, and it'll require a concerted effort by all the stakeholders to really fix those issues in a time-bound manner. If we were to take advantage of this crisis and come out more digitally enabled as an ecosystem. You're on mute, Amit.
Oh, sorry. I'll squeeze in one last question, which TT Venkat has asked as a follow-up of his earlier question regarding the wealth management piece. His question really is that do you think MFIs will turn into distribution channels which will have more diversified revenue streams, which they will sort of use to boost their ROAs and profitability, etc. I recall that there were several MFIs who were selling solar lanterns and stuff like that to their customers, mobile phones, solar lanterns, and all of that. Do you think more and more MFIs will adopt those models, or what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do think that will happen, and I think two aspects will emerge there. One is that they will become distributors not just of non financial products, but just of financial products itself. And I think that in the current context, banks will see this as an opportunity to sort of get into the rural space, into the low income household space, but they don't have the distribution capacity, so they will look at the MFI apparatus to become distributors, and you'll find acceleration of PC models, co-lending models, securitization models, direct origination models. You will see an acceleration of all of that as a combination of MFIs becoming originators and then banks becoming wholesale lenders. So that's one trend I think we will see an acceleration in. We will also see an acceleration of cross-selling non-financial products. KGFS is a own example, although of a very small base. We have a small e-commerce sort of line which cross-sells consumer durables to low-income households, rural, in partnership with an e-commerce platform. And we've seen phenomenal, off a low base, but phenomenal appetite and growth rate in that business. So I think we will see both of them.
And one of the concerns that investors typically have had with MFIs cross-selling non-financial products is that these loans then tend to become more consumption loans than capital asset creation loans. So how do you address some of those concerns? And in your limited experience, have you seen the cohort to whom you sell non-financial product? Have you seen that cohort behave differently? Have you seen the delinquency levels higher in that cohort?
Not at all. We've actually seen that over the last 10, 12 years, the balance sheets of rural households, although official data may give another story, but on the ground we see that they've become stronger. We see that their own aspirations are about having those consumer durables at home. So we just need to recognize those consumer aspirations, honor, respect them, not pass judgments on that aspiration, and be able to satisfy into that. We've not seen any adverse credit behavior by those consumers who have gone for these sort of consumption loans. We see both of them quite nicely coexisting, the livelihood loans as well as consumption loans. I think we've just got to trust the ability of these low-income households. They've been AAA plus borrowers by all standards in normal situations. They are pretty savvy in managing their sort of surpluses and their requirements.
Great. On that note, Samir, thank you so much for taking the time out to chat with me. It's been a pleasure and a learning experience chatting to you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure's all mine, Amit. Thanks for giving me the opportunity, and to all the sort of guests who have asked fantastic questions.
Thank you so much. To the audience, my request would be if you could comment on the LinkedIn profile about your suggestions regarding this session, and also if you could name people whom you would like to hear in the next couple of sessions, that would give me some direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amit.
Thank you.